So, as the chairman noted, we are on the doorstep of significant reform for interregional planning and possibly the establishment of a minimum bulk transfer requirement. So it's my privilege today to sit with this distinguished and diverse panelists. So I'll do brief introductions and then turn it over to each of them to tell you more about themselves. And as you can see up on the slide deck here, Liza is also going to give us a brief overview of the Grid Deployment Office. So there'll be an educational component as well for all of us. So I'll start with David Kelley, who's a distinguished engineer at Southwest Power Pool with more than 20 years of experience in the field. And he's currently the Vice President of Engineering for the SPP. So David?
Thank you, Stacey. And it's a tremendous honor for me to be here. It's actually my first WIRES meeting, so I want to really thank Larry and Stacey for inviting me to be here today. And typically when I'm on a panel talking about interregional transmission, almost invariably it's with other ISO RTOs talking about why it's not working. And so I really appreciate the diversity of this panel and sitting with some other non-ISO RTO representatives to talk about this topic. It's really challenging. I've been involved in SEAMS activities and interregional transmission planning for the better part of my career at SPP. I've been there almost 15 years and sort of lived through the blood, sweat, and tears of the initial rollout of Order 1000 and led our team's response to that, the negotiation aspects with our neighboring planning regions, and the process that we have in place in our joint operating agreements and our tariff today. And got the benefit, if you will, of overseeing a lot of the transmission planning studies as well that we've conducted ever since then. And certainly with some mixed success, which I'm sure we'll get into in some of our line of questioning here in a little bit. But I think when I look back on FERC Order 1000, and at least in my view, of having lived with this from day one and setting all the processes and procedures up, I think from the interregional aspect of it, where it kind of fell short, was not clearly defining what an interregional project really was, and really even what the problem was trying to be solved with building interregional transmission. I'll tell you, in setting up all the processes and procedures, it was around, can we build an interregional transmission project cheaper, more efficiently, and provide as much value than what we can on our own, what we can do regionally. And so what we were looking at is, what are the regional issues we're trying to solve first and foremost? And then asking ourselves, is there a cheaper solution to do it across borders? Well, we shouldn't be surprised that it's not cheaper, more efficient to build something across a really large seam. But I think what we weren't really asking ourselves is, what's the right problem to solve? Which I think really gets into this great topic around transfer capability and whether or not we should have a minimum amount. That is starting to ask, I think, the right question that might lead to better development of interregional transmission. So look forward to the conversation.
No, that's a great introduction, David, and really appreciate the unique RTO perspective that you bring, certainly because SPP has been a leader in the introduction of renewables. So we know that's also part of the challenge. So next on the panel is Daniel Palken, who has a PhD in physics, and is a legislative assistant for energy and natural resources for the office of Senator John Hickenlooper of Colorado. Daniel?
Yeah, thank you, Stacey. I want to start by thanking all of you for being here and having me on the panel. I also want to echo what David said, that I am very excited to serve on this panel with these two people beside me, and with Stacey. I've learned a ton from the three of you collectively in my time in this space. I'm speaking from my own opinions here, so not everything I say necessarily reflects the opinion of the senator. But I will start by saying that we come at this issue in the senator's office from the perspective of kind of looking at the status of our energy grid now, looking where and how it is evolving, and looking at what the rest of the world is doing as our energy systems transition. The figures that really stick in my head on this, kind of from a national, international perspective, is that if we look only at kind of the largest scale transmission lines that are built interregionally, the US and North America as a whole has built about 7 gigawatts of large scale interregional transmission since 2014. Our peer and rival nations are nowhere near that, because they're way off in the other direction. South America has built 22 gigawatts, Europe has built 44, and China has built 260. So we are really losing in a game of international competitiveness where our peer and rival nations have woken up to the notion that a 21st century grid really does need to be able to move power across nations and even continents at times. And fortunately for us, we live in a country where we're blessed with a wide range of resources, from gas to wind to solar, and they're all very differently geographically distributed. A lot of our nations that are our competitors today don't have that sort of resource and geographic diversity. It's something that is a great strategic advantage to us, and it's also that grounds itself out, though, in costs and reliability for ratepayers and consumers. And that's obviously, all of us are here thinking about how we can keep energy costs low, how we can keep the grid running efficiently and reliably, and not suffer the blackouts and the disturbances that we've seen all too frequently in the last several years. So, I talk about international competitiveness, but it grounds itself out in kind of the base attributes of how the grid functions, and we'll be speaking more about that on the panel today, so thank you.
And we also have Liza Reed, who recently joined the Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office. Liza?
Thank you so much, Stacey. I'm going to walk and talk just for the benefit of all of our time here and get to my slides. Similarly, thank you so much to WIRES for having me here for my first meeting, and particularly giving me my first opportunity to speak as a department from the podium, and then my personal opinions from the chair. So to Stacey's point about being on the doorstep and the commissioner's point about being on the doorstep, the Grid Deployment Office is absolutely an indicator of, now what's the metaphor? Are we the foyer? I don't know. Maybe we're the first step on the doorstep. But this reorganization that I'm so excited to tell you about today really demonstrates a whole new perspective on what the Department of Energy can do and what the federal government can do to be moving forward with transmission broadly, but also with this interregional transmission opportunity. I'm going to blow through these slides because it's largely to introduce you to this office, very high-level overview, tons of words, but you can see the slides later. I just think it's important to give you a sense of the scope of what we are undertaking at the Grid Deployment Office. And then we'll get into the sort of heart of discussion. So the Grid Deployment Office is a new office in the infrastructure, under the Undersecretary of Infrastructure, S3. It was established less than a year ago. We're coming up on our birthday in July. The director is Maria Robinson. And there are 3 divisions within the Grid Deployment Office: generation credits, transmission, and grid modernization. I am maybe obviously in the transmission division. That's what brings me here today. But what the Grid Deployment Office is intended to do is pull together authority from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, and understand how we can coordinate this new authority, capability, and financing that Congress has given the Department of Energy to provide electricity to everyone, right? To invest and maintain in this critical infrastructure, everything we've been hearing all morning from folks about how difficult it is to maintain infrastructure, how old this infrastructure is, and how we need a new grid of the future. And the Grid Deployment Office is the Department of Energy's organization around that effort. So the Generation Credits Division is using, again, Bill and IRA funds to support existing generation facilities for reliability and resilience. Transmission Division, I'll spend most of my time, I guess 3 of my 5 minutes, on the Transmission Division, looking at the many different ways we're trying to invest in innovative solutions in transmission. As I'm sure you've heard the Secretary say, deploy, deploy, deploy. Transmission has so much opportunity for deployment. It's not just literal gigawatt miles, it's also talking about technologies, right? It's placement of technologies, it's new technologies, it's thinking differently, even deploying new transmission planning ideas, right? There's just a lot of opportunity for deployment here. And then Grid Modernization Division. This is really a fascinating group that's overseeing activities related to outages and resilience of the grid, and this spans from storage to distribution to transmission. This is just some of the this is most of the funding that we are managing at GDO. You can add up the millions and billions. It's an enormous remit. It's an incredible opportunity that we are investing in. Civil Nuclear Credits Program and Hydro Incentives and Generation Credits. I'm not going to read all of these for you, but again, I'll step through the transmission ones quite briefly here. So in the transmission division of GDO, we sort of mentally organize around 3 ideas: enhanced planning, siting and permitting, and then commercial facilitation. And I'm sure you will recognize sort of an underlying 3P idea here. The other P that I think is important is participation, right? We heard the panel earlier talking about the role of participation in that process. And I think you will find that as we are implementing all of these new programs at GDO, participation and stakeholder engagement and really robust and meaningful processes and engagement is something that we are trying to thread throughout. So some examples of enhanced planning are the transmission needs study. Hopefully you have heard of the transmission needs study. The draft needs study was published in February. Comments just closed last week. And this is part of an authority under the Federal Power Act 216A, and it enables the future siting of national interest electric transmission corridors. Happy to chat more about those. Again, I don't want to dive into any of these in detail for the sake of time, but the transmission needs study is the first step in unlocking some of that financing and planning authority that we have. And that was looking at current and anticipated future needs of the grid. This was not new modeling. This is reviewing many, many studies. My colleagues did an incredible undertaking to put together this needs study and identify where we already know that we have congestion problems and where we will have congestion problems. The other type of enhanced planning is a National Transmission Planning Study. This is a joint effort between NREL and PNNL. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this one because it's important to understand what it is and what it is not, right? This enhanced planning study is taking a national view of things. It's not replacing any planning. It is intended to inform existing planning efforts by providing a national perspective, looking at strategies for decarbonization, doing stakeholder engagement, again, with a broader view than most existing planning processes can undertake right now. And so that's what we mean about enhancing. So that's our planning initiative, and then offshore wind as well. This is obviously an area that needs a lot of focus, and there's a tremendous opportunity in the United States. We've focused efforts so far on the Atlantic coast and recently kicked off some West Coast activities in the Gulf of Mexico, Great Lakes, and Gulf of Maine. Will be coming next. So that's just one segment that transmission is undertaking. Next on siting and permitting, there's the TSED program, Transmission Siting and Economic Development Grant. Again, this ties directly into the environmental justice panel from this morning, where they were talking about community benefits and how we ensure that benefits are being equitably distributed. There's funding in TSED for siting and permitting. It's essentially sort of a technical assistance. What are ways that this funding can support siting authorities in evaluating transmission projects? But then there's also economic development. So what are ways that these dollars can support communities who are interested in sort of communities and projects to make a transmission project make sense for everybody involved? So that RFI was released in January, comments closed in February, and you should be seeing more activity in that area in the coming months. The Transmission Facilitation Program, so this is a funding opportunity directly for transmission lines. You may be familiar with the anchor tenant idea. So this is a federal authority for the Department of Energy to be an anchor tenant to catalyze capacity and to catalyze high capacity transmission that maybe couldn't be as large or couldn't happen without some early investment from the federal government. This is a revolving fund, so our intention is to invest in things where we also get our money back. It's $2 billion. There's the anchor tenant, that's the capacity contracts, there's the loans, and then there's the public-private partnerships. And those can happen in national interest electricity corridors, and then between states and regions. So in my remarks, I'll talk more about how this all ties into interregional. There's even more funding available than these things that I've discussed. There's facility financing, there's the loan programs office, there's the existing WAPA TIP program, right, and the funding that's been brought to that. Then in GRIP, this is in the Grid Modernization Division, there's significant funding that touches, again, across the span of storage, distribution, and transmission. The formula grants, I've highlighted that application deadline has been extended to May 31st. Those are formula grants for states, tribes, and territories. The GRIP program is the Grid Resilience and Innovative Partnerships Program, and this, in the bill, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there were a number of different authorities that provided funding to different types of stakeholders. And I actually think that demonstrates a really important observation on the part of Congress, that there are a lot of stakeholders and a lot of players at the table, and how we think about paying for things requires a lot of engagement from all of them. And so we've got the resilience industry grants, right? Smart grid grants are for higher education, nonprofits, for-profits, and state entities. The Grid Innovation Program, those final applications are due May 19th. That is funding that goes to states and local governments and tribal governments as well. So again, we see different opportunities for different stakeholders to get funding. And then finally, I'll share that I can't cover everything. There's a lot of details, but we have a map. So we have an interactive tool, the Grid Deployment Office Conductor, acts as a clearinghouse for all of these opportunities. So you're welcome to contact me, and I'm happy to connect you with my colleagues, but also we have a tool for some sort of easy DIY investigation on these opportunities. And we've started, as I said, I showed you all those deadlines. Those are first round funding deadlines. In almost every case, we expect to have a second tranche later this year for fiscal year 2024. So that was a lot. That was more than 5 minutes, but we had so much to cover.
That was fantastic, Liza. Given the relative newness of the office, I think that overview was informative for all of us here in the audience. So appreciate that perspective. So as we begin, I guess my first question for the panel is really, is it worth it? Right? What is the value of interregional transmission from your particular seat and your perspective? And I'll ask you to start, David, of course, from an RTO perspective.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I think it helps if we start with a common understanding of what interregional transmission actually is. And it sounds like a simple question, but it's much harder to answer than you might think. Just by way of example, SPP and MISO have about 45,000 megawatts of tie line capability between us today. So one might ask, well, can't you just transfer 45,000 megawatts between the two of you? Not even close. Back during Winter Storm Uri, we were importing from the east of us about 6,000 megawatts. And that certainly saved our bacon in a lot of ways. But that was the most we've ever imported in the entirety of our operational existence. So I bring that up to say that interregional transmission isn't just simply adding new tie lines between regions. It's much more complicated, as you might expect, and for most of the engineers in the room, you understand this, that as a grid operator, we're always operating to the next worst thing that can happen. So we're never allowing the system to get to its full thermal capabilities, because we always have to plan for what happens if something bad happens. And so what we end up with is what are oftentimes a lot of localized constraints that prevent transactions from being able to actually take place efficiently between regions. So I don't think that can get lost in this question of what is interregional transmission and ultimately what is the value of interregional transmission. Because ultimately what may prove to be the most beneficial is not necessarily stringing up new wire between SPP and MISO, for example, but fixing some of the localized constraints that allow us to better take advantage of the grid that's already there. And we've certainly observed that in some of our existing studies that we've conducted to date. Now, back to the real question of value. I think we've heard some of that discussed this morning about the economic value of being able to access low-cost energy in different parts of the region, and certainly within an interconnection, but I would argue even across interconnections. If we're serious about resiliency and economic and environmental value across this country, I think we need to stop looking at just what we can do within neighboring planning regions or even within an interconnection, and talk about how can we actually move energy across the entirety of the country. Reliability and resiliency is something that, of course, gets a lot of conversation. I've already mentioned Winter Storm Uri. We talked about that at the time in the context of one 100-year storm, and then the very next year we had another one with Winter Storm Elliott. So we've stopped using that terminology. We are beginning to transform our planning and operational processes to be better aware and prepared for these types of events to come much more frequently than they have in the past. And I'd be remiss if I didn't, at least in terms of this question, bring up some of the efforts that we've been working on with MISO around the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue Study. So when it comes to things like being able to enable the interconnection of new generation and unlock interconnection queues, it was already said this morning, I think proactive planning is going to be one of the keys there. We've worked with our neighbors over at MISO for the better part of 3 years now and developed a portfolio of 5 major EHV projects that we believe will unlock about 30 gigawatts of generation to be able to be interconnected along the SPP MISO seam. So we're pretty excited about that, and certainly wanting to take advantage of a lot of the funding out there that's available that Liza just spoke about, and we're going through that process as well. So there's a lot of value, I think, to be had across the nation when we get serious about interregional transmission, and we can all get on the same page as to what it actually is and what it should do.
No, thanks for that perspective, David. Daniel, as we ponder this question of why, right? Is it economic? Is it reliability based? David has spoken to sort of, the planning aspect of this and the need to recognize that extreme weather events have significantly changed our landscape and how we think about the value of transmission. So from your seat on the Hill, or adjacent there too, Daniel, how do you conceive of that question?
Yeah, well, I want to start by just remarking on one thing David said that I couldn't agree with more strongly, that transfer capability is obviously a very distinct concept that is generically lesser than, in terms of its quantitative value, total transmission capacity. And so it's not just having the lines built, it's building them in the right places and having the ability to move power. But when it comes to the value and why we want to do this and what the case for it is, I think we really should ground ourselves in at least kind of a high-level view of some of the numbers. So I'm showing a slide here, and maybe I'll borrow Liza's technique of actually moving to the podium to talk over it, which I did not make this, I did not do this research. This was done by the brilliant folks at DOE, at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Dev Milstein and others. I'm sure many of you have seen this, but I really just want to dwell on it for a minute and kind of walk through what it's saying, because I think it really delivers a pretty impactful punch on kind of what the value and what the opportunity we're staring at with respect to interregional transmission is. So what the researchers at Berkeley Lab did was they just looked at the LMPs at different hubs on the grid where energy is, different nodes on the grid where energy is traded fairly frequently. They integrated a bit zonally so as to combat some saturation effects. And then crucially, at each of those nodes, or rather for the pairs of those nodes that you see lines drawn between, they did the age-old mathematical technique of putting a minus sign between two numbers. That's all the math they did. And then they integrated and averaged it up so that they quantified the value, just the value of really price arbitrage, if you were able to actually move power from one location to the other, every hour of every day of every year for 10 years. And they quantified it in millions of dollars per 1,000 megawatts of power that you could transfer. And what I want to say here, what I want to really impress upon you, if you remember anything that I say today, is just how large these numbers are, right? These are millions of dollars per 1,000 megawatts, sorry, and I should have said per year. So we're talking about 50, 75, 100-year investments. The average cost of 1,000 megawatts of transmission, by the way, is about $700 million. So a large sounding number, but absolutely tiny compared to the amount of money that you could make back just from being able to move power around. And this shouldn't surprise us because it's a symptom of our having essentially stopped building this stuff for the last decade plus. And the grid has evolved substantially to the point where there is a lot of variable power. Even the non-variable power we've seen on too many occasions fail to always be able to deliver when we need it. So there really is an incredible value in a select number of hours for being able to move power around. So we're looking at, you can pretty much pin the tail anywhere on the map and find an area where you're netting $100 million a year, or $200 million a year, or $300 or $700 million a year. We're a Western office, Colorado. I always like to say that if this were the 1800s and we were talking about infrastructure projects this massive, that nevertheless had this stunning a payoff, $200 million a year in today's dollars, the technical term for this would be a gold mine. This is really an incredible opportunity, and we're sitting on them in every part of the country practically. Now, there are some limitations to the study. For one, they only looked historically, right, at 2012 to 2021. I also want to dwell on that for a second, because this isn't anybody's net zero model or their prediction of where we're going to be in 2050. This is a historical tome of what we left on the table for the last 10 years by not having transmission. Now, nobody knows exactly where the grid is evolving, but I think we can all guess directionally that given the trends on the grid, given all the factors that people have discussed, we're heading in a direction where these numbers are going to get larger. The researchers actually updated their data for the first 6 months of 2022, and they actually just put out the full 2022. The full 2022 numbers are even slightly larger than these. But let's just dwell on these, because this is essentially the one-year update for the year following that research. And all those 200s you saw are now 300s. There's some 400s. So these numbers really do seem to only be going in one direction. But unless we overcome the inertia, and unless we actually are able to build these interregional lines, which, as we're going to discuss, are very hard, there's a lot of inertia in the system that makes it very hard to kind of build between territories, between regions. We will never realize these benefits. I also just kind of want to end by saying that this, the reliability versus economic distinction is both real and artificial. There are things that can kind of purely be categorized as one or the other, but oftentimes they bleed into the other, the two of them. So the Berkeley Lab folks found that 50% of the value accrued in just 5% of the hours. So it's those same hours, presumably, when grid operators are concerned about reliability, concerned about resiliency, but also you have the highest difference in prices because those are caused by, those are symptoms of the same disease. So, part of what we need to do in addressing this is start thinking holistically about the benefits we're going to gain and not segmenting benefits. Because when we're talking about the costs of these lines, we're not segmenting the costs. We're not saying structure number 738 through 943 are reliability structures, and then the other ones to the left and right are affordability structures. We should think about benefits in the same way, and we should think about the relation of reliability, resiliency, affordability. Yeah.
No, this is a conversation.
How sensitive is this? Oh, okay. Nina with ITC. How sensitive is this model to changes in gas prices? Because usually when I see these LMP models, when gas prices fall, the arbitrage is much less.
Yeah, I mean, gas prices are setting the clearing price in a lot of markets, so they're going to be pretty sensitive. But let's talk about kind of the trends in gas prices very briefly. With the shale revolution in the 10, 15 years ago, we saw a sharp decline with all the production and the capital pouring into that space. Oil and gas was one of the worst performing sectors, ask any Wall Street investor, for the past decade and a half. They've made a little bit of that money back during kind of the COVID crunch as oil and gas has seen quite the premium. But I think there's a strong consensus on Wall Street that they were very over leveraged there. And that even now with prices very, very high for oil and quite high for gas over the last year or two, you have not seen companies putting money back into new drilling operations. They've disproportionately put it into essentially paying shareholders back and recouping some of those losses they suffered relative to the market and just often in absolute terms over those past 15 years. So it's a fool's errand to try to predict the prices of certainly oil, but also gas. But I do think that the general trends point in a direction where we certainly shouldn't just assume that we're going to see low gas prices in a stable environment for the next 10, 20, 30 years, let alone the lifetime of these transmission assets that we're talking about. So my guess is that if I had to guess, that the trends in gas prices we're likely to see over the next few decades are likely to make these values larger rather than smaller, all else equal.
Right, and then my last technical question was just, the price arbitrage is coming from levelizing the peak clearing price in each market. So by definition, does that mean that some regions actually will be getting higher prices and some regions will get lower prices when you do these connections?
So yeah, to the degree that you start saturating these effects and you start pulling these numbers closer together, which obviously is the ultimate goal. You of course don't want all the numbers perfectly close together. That would mean you've overinvested in some sense in large scale transmission. We're in no danger of doing that. Just rest assured. But let me think about this for a second. So yeah, there can be winners and losers when it comes to transmission. I think a really key point is that the winners win by more than the losers lose by. If you look at a histogram of the wholesale clearing prices of electricity in any of the RTOs, you'll see that it's a distribution with a very thin and high tail. So on the low end, prices can go negative, but they don't go that negative, and they kind of cluster there. On the high end, they can get quite arbitrarily high, as we've seen in recent winter storms. And so you have this feature where at the high end, you have these very high prices. But if you go, an RTO away, which is often about 400, 500, 600 miles, the prices are going to be pretty uncorrelated from that. And that's not just me asserting that. That's actually a fact that we heard presented by Chris Clack, I'm obligated to say, from Colorado, at the FERC workshop on minimum transfer. He pointed out that there's a phenomenon in weather physics called the Rossby radius, where the characteristic length scale of weather is about 600 miles in our neck of the woods in the kind of the northwestern hemisphere. And so when you build transmission about 600 miles away, that can either be one massive line or more commonly can be kind of a neighbor's neighbor type situation. You are diversifying the grid to the point where it's bigger than the weather, and you actually exploit anti-correlations in what the weather is doing. So if you know it's windy in Las Vegas, and you go 600 miles east of Las Vegas, you can then go to the casinos in Vegas and make money all day betting that it won't be windy 600 miles east of there, because that's how the weather works in the US, and it always has worked that way, and even with climate change, we're likely to see that phenomenon persist for a while into the future. So we should be exploiting those advantages. Those are huge advantages of living in a very wide country. Many countries don't have that, so yeah.
So I'm going to ask that we pause some questions so that we can get through the panel, but I love this level of engagement. But I want to make sure that everyone on the panel has an opportunity. We have an opportunity to present sort of a fulsome view of the issue, and I know there's a lot to unpack here. But that said, as I'm on my way to Vegas, is there anything you wanted to add, Liza, with respect to the value proposition for Interregional before we turn to other questions?
I'll sort of just underscore what everybody said. In the interest of time, I won't go through 5 Department of Energy talking points, but cost, reliability, and resilience are sort of obviously the values there, and we're looking at opportunities for how we can especially help that cost piece, right? There is all of this funding investment that can help with, well, I guess there's cost and price, and I've now used the word cost to cover both, but we can help with cost, which only increases the value, right, that build transmission gets, right? It takes down that $700 million bulk investment number, but then you still get all that value that you see coming through here. So tremendous opportunity.
So starting with the proposition that it is valuable, and noting that there are questions around exactly what that value might be, and we can have further discussion around that, I guess I'll ask a general question to the panel. What's the problem? Define the problem, right? We have Order 1000. Interregional coordination is required today. So why hasn't it happened? Is the RTO the problem? Is it, economic forces? How do you perceive this issue of why it hasn't happened sort of organically based on, today's environment, today's, legislative mandates, et cetera? Why hasn't it happened today? And I'll open that up to the panel.
Yeah, and I'll start. I think, Daniel, you teed it up really nicely in your comments about the need to take a holistic look at value. And I don't think we as an industry have typically done that when it comes to transmission. At least I look back at my career at SPP, our planning process has certainly evolved, even as an RTO, from looking at how do we solve the issues of delivering our low-cost generation to serve our load in the most cost-effective way to keep costs affordable from even a transmission and an energy perspective within our region. We've got this slide that I use in just about every one of my educational new onboarding presentations that I give, is that there's this optimization that we're always seeking to get between transmission investment and the value that we get, both from a reliability and from a low-cost energy delivery perspective. But I'll tell you, as an ISO RTO, in accordance with the SPP tariff, the projects that we identify are allocated to our customers, our ratepayers. It ultimately comes down to a cost allocation question and whether or not we're seeking the right value, which is, again, I said this in my opening remarks, why I really like this question about transfer capability, because we're starting to ask different questions about the value of transmission than just how do we resolve congestion, localized congestion to deliver, SPP's generation to serve SPP's load. How do we maintain the typical notion of what reliability is, of keeping the lights on under an N-1 condition? We're beginning to ask ourselves, I think, broader, more holistic questions about the value. So I think if we can get to a point where, from a cost allocation standpoint, we're not necessarily looking at the real granular definition of benefits like what we have historically done, where we're really trying to allocate costs of transmission as closely as possible to those that are deemed to be benefiting, right? And so we've got, at least in SPP, a whole suite of benefit metrics we use in our planning process. This notion of moving energy across the country is a completely different view of value. And I think we're going to talk about cost allocation later. I think that's going to warrant a different view of how we allocate the cost of these types of projects than how we've historically done it. So I think that is ultimately the barrier that has stood in the way, is just we don't have a common understanding of what the value is of this type of transmission that we're trying to get.
I would add to that, I'm a big fan of the 3 Ps as a kind of useful framing for kind of breaking down the barriers: paying, permitting, planning. I loved, by the way, learning on the EJ panel that we have a 3 Ps of EJ now with, what was it, practices, processes, paradigm. So it's really spreading. Everybody should have 3 Ps. But I do think that's a good heuristic. On the permitting side, you have what has been described sometimes as a federalism mismatch. This also infuses itself into the paying and planning buckets as well. But you have the middle state problem. You have middle counties who just you don't get the same sort of benefit from being in the middle of a long transmission line that you get from being elsewhere. On the paying side, David already spoke very well to the challenges with cost allocation. On the planning side, we don't have kind of a robust, there are certain regions that have made very admirable efforts, SPP included, to pair up with neighbors and target specific projects. But as kind of a holistic thing nationwide, there isn't an interregional planning process that all of the regions are collectively going through or required to go through. And you all work at utilities. If I ask you, is it easier to go out and do a local project or a local upgrade on a line? Or do you want to kind of build something which allows you to move power from 3 utility service territories over? The answer is kind of very intuitively obvious which of those is harder and which of them is easier. So I think that it shouldn't surprise us that there really are real barriers here, and they deserve to be taken seriously.
Yeah, I want to comment a little bit on the planning barrier, and I highlighted, or previewed, I should say, a little bit in the slides, so I think you know what I'm going to say here, which is that it is not anyone's responsibility to do interregional planning, right? And there's a requirement for interregional planning, but we heard the commissioner talk about it this morning, right? And we've heard some reflection on this panel already about sort of how that responsibility is currently defined. And one could say, and I'm speaking as myself, I need to clarify, I'm speaking as myself, limited in that definition, right? And in the ordering of how it's implemented. And that's why we've undertaken this enhanced planning initiative, right? We have a requirement from Congress to do the needs study, but then that national transmission planning study sort of takes that needs study and adds to the conversation about how there's existing and future congestion, but there's also all of these things that we don't know, right? The scenarios are so important, and scenarios that cross regions are so important, and asking SPP to be figuring out what MISO is doing or what MISO might be doing, right? Like that shouldn't be SPP's responsibility necessarily. But there is an opportunity to think about that interregional planning requirements and how they could be changed, right? Under the existing NOPR, DOE comments include ideas like a common framework, right? We don't have a common framework for how that joint planning should happen, for how SPP and MISO should be talking to each other and understanding, sort of having a common understanding of things. And so DOE is doing what we can with the tools that we have and the perspective that we have to kind of inform that. And I think there's opportunity to take the existing requirements and make them a little more meaningful towards action.
So in terms of action, do we need some sort of forcing mechanism? Do we need a minimum bulk transfer requirement? Do we need legislation? Let's talk about solutions. How do we get there?
I can start on this one. It's a matter close to heart. So the answer is yes. We do believe we need that. We have been working on a bill in our office called the Big Wires Act, It is a minimum transfer requirement for each region to be able to transfer 30% of its peak load collectively with its neighbors. So it's a requirement on transfer capability over peak load. And the goal of the bill and the aim of the policy is to be very tech neutral with respect to that. There's a lot of ways to achieve transfer capability, and we don't want to foreclose our options on one at the expense of another. So a lot of it probably will be new build, transmission lines. A lot of it probably also will be maintaining and upgrading the existing system, reconductoring, doing other things that kind of appeal to using existing rights of ways and alleviating kind of process difficulties on that side. And then also, you can reduce peak load. We're open to the full kind of, spectrum of possibilities here. If you're doing something to reduce the denominator of that equation, that should also count, because what we're focused on in this bill is the overall goal. The mechanism in the heart of our bill, just to advertise it for a second, is that after an initial rulemaking, there will be a 2-year period when all of the regions, by which I largely mean the RTOs and the Order 1000 regions, will have to negotiate amongst each other in kind of a simultaneous bilateral fashion how they are going to build these lines, and specifically who the entities are that's going to build them, who's going to pay for the lines, so cost allocation, and then what their timeline is. They're going to have to submit those plans to FERC within 2 years, and if they don't submit them to FERC, FERC is empowered to do that planning and designation for them. So FERC kind of plays the simultaneous role in this vision of backstop and boogeyman. Regions would probably rather negotiate with each other, even if they sometimes have a hard time doing that, than have FERC come in and do it for them. And so the hope is that this would be a good incentive and good encouragement for regions to actually do this. And it allows that regional flexibility, because regions will intrinsically have a better idea what's best for themselves and for their members and for their ratepayers. So that is essentially the bill in outline and concept. I know I've talked to a lot of companies and organizations in this audience alone and on this panel about this bill at various stages, and I want to thank those who have provided input for that input. You've really transformed the bill for the better. Those of you who haven't had a chance to talk to our office about it, please do reach out to us. We are very eager to accept feedback from across the country. You need have no tie to Colorado. We're very eager to talk to you. And also thank the organizations in this crowd who have already endorsed the legislation for doing that. So it's something where we're working to build that support. But ultimately, yes, I think there does need to be a forcing mechanism, because fundamentally what we're up against here, the reason we have not built all this transmission is not because we have a room full of philosopher kings who are calculating the technocratically optimal solution, and at every stage of the way have decided that we should build absolutely nothing. It's because there is a lot of stickiness and a lot of inertia in the system, and when that's your problem, a forcing mechanism is the right mechanism for overcoming it.
Yeah, and I agree. I'd like to say that we wouldn't need a forcing function, but I think if we all are honest with ourselves, we'd say, especially when it comes to timing, if we want to get there within any sort of reasonable amount of time, then I think some forcing function is going to have to be there. But the reason I was hedging a little bit is the question of interregional transfer capability and the value, at least from an SPP perspective, has been there for a while now. And certainly Winter Storm Uri and Elliott have sort of raised the level of discussion within our region about that. And we didn't need a forcing function to see that value, right? But I don't think we all want to wait until every part of the country has experienced something like that, right? Where all of a sudden it becomes a critical timing issue where we can't build transmission in, it seems like, about a decade now. And if we don't get ahead of it, we're not going to, I think, get there together as a nation and accomplish what we want to do. So I think the forcing function at the federal level, and that's where I think it really needs to come from, in coordination with the states, is necessary to get us there in any reasonable amount of time.
I'll comment briefly. So my colleague, Dr. Adria Books, spoke at the FERC staff-led workshop in December, and I want to thank the Commission for that opportunity, for the Department of Energy, and for the community to come together on this topic. And you're welcome to review that, and then, of course, the comments are closing, I think, in a couple of weeks. Is that right? Or, yeah, 2.5, 3 weeks. And so we'll have more comments on sort of that question of sort of a forcing function and what it might look like. But what I can share is that we do discuss in our December comments and then sort of in these coming publications, the ways that you measure that, right? That there's this question of a forcing function. There's also a question of like, how do you measure that, right? So Daniel has given one example in this legislation of how you think about what that number should be and how you should force it. So there's certainly interest and support from the Department of Energy for those sort of efforts, and we've weighed in on that. And the other thing I'll share is that we're focused on what forcing functions we've already been given, right? I mean, the offshore wind planning requirements, I mean, that's sort of a fascinating interregional discussion in a way, right? Because offshore wind is not feeding into a single state, right? And that's what makes it so important to be having interregional discussions. And so I think it's also interesting just to think about how the investments we already have are starting to change these conversations and starting to change state dynamics, right? That we're seeing states coming together to talk about sharing power for offshore wind. And as David mentioned in his opening remarks, getting the power onshore is not the only problem, right? Like that also is going to require conversations about how you move that power among and between the regions. So I think there's just some really interesting efforts that are already going on. And then I highlighted the transmission facilitation program. The public-private partnerships part of that has an opportunity to enter into a public-private partnership for the DOE, to enter into a public-private partnership for lines that explicitly connect two planning regions or two states. Right, so I'm heartened that there is that indication from Congress, that is a statutory requirement, that there's this need for an interregional focus and an interregional prioritization. So I think we're seeing a lot of that starting to happen too.
So I'll take one last question for the panel and then open it up. But you know, your point about offshore wind and the sort of different technologies that are available as we consider the role of interregional transmission is interesting. But I think, you know, we've all heard, particularly at the Joint Federal and State Task Force, sort of universal support for the concept of interregional transmission at a high level, right? But where does the rubber really meet the road? And that's cost allocation, right? So how do we conceive of that? You know, to David's point, you know, this is a different sort of concept that we've really sort of tackled. Is the solution to peanut butter it across everyone? How do we conceive of the benefits in this space?
Yeah, so I'll start. And I think we have to start with the notion, and we all get on the same page with the fact that transmission provides a lot of different types of benefits. And I know we've sort of had that alluded to in different discussion points already this morning. And so what we're doing within SPP, we're developing what we call a consolidated planning process. And the intent there is to try to identify what are all the needs we're trying to solve within the region. Not just interconnecting new generation, not just resolving congestion, not just serving load in the most reliable and efficient way, but doing all those things together. And I see interregional transfer capability as like another one of those value propositions that we need to be looking at in the planning that we're already doing. So it's value stacking, right? And I think for all of you that run businesses, you're always looking at how do you squeeze more value out of the assets that you already have. So when we're picking new transmission, I think we need to be looking at all those benefits we're already calculating and determining and adding on to that. How does the transmission we're picking better enable us to move energy from point A to point B across the country? If we get to that point, then I think it becomes an easier question to answer, because most of those other benefits that we're already talking about, we have an existing cost allocation methodology for. So then we're kind of talking about what do we do on the margins for those additional benefits. And this is where, at least in my opinion, not speaking on behalf of SPP, so sort of give that same disclaimer that others have, is that that's going to take federal leadership. That's going to take something like an Eisenhower moment where we design the interstate transmission system and taxpayers pay for it. And I mean, let's face it, not everybody across this country is going to benefit equally from being able to move energy from one part of the country to the other. But if this is truly what this nation wants, I think that incremental value that transmission creates from being able to move more power, that's going to take some federal leadership and I think some federal cost allocation in order to help make that happen.
I would say that I'll answer this maybe in the context of minimum transfer and lines built under a minimum transfer law or rule at FERC or other paradigm, because that's the context in which I've thought most about it. I think what we saw from the Lawrence Berkeley slide that I showed earlier, right? And the point of that slide was not to like take the third significant digit of those numbers and like say that's the real value. The point was to show that the orders of magnitude between costs and benefits are there seems to be really an order of magnitude between them, just at kind of a surface high level. Right, the benefit that is showing, which is just, reduced rates essentially for ratepayers is what that's a proxy for. That is a benefit that nobody really deeply disagrees about. There are a lot in the congressional environment and in the political sphere, there's a lot of different benefits. There's public policy benefits, there's environmental benefits, carbon that people talk about that are not widely agreed upon by all stakeholders in the transmission and the energy space. I think in the context of thinking about minimum transfer requirements and kind of setting a floor, which is not simultaneously intended to be a ceiling, we should also kind of think in terms of what is the common denominator of benefits that people agree upon. So kind of a conservative set of on-grid benefits around ratepayers saving money, around reliability benefits, resiliency. That is kind of the place to start to quantify and to build out from, rather than to kind of start with the most ambitious and exotic.
I'll bring it back to community benefits agreements briefly, because I think that is not viewed as part of a cost allocation solution, because very technically it's not, right? So I appreciate that. But I think it's important to recognize that one of the reasons we need to keep talking about things like community benefits agreements, and that the department is engaged in in setting a standard on that, right, and pulling together best practices and ensuring that community benefits agreements are part of all of our funding opportunities. And then the T said, the transmission, siting, and economic development, right? Part of that money is explicitly for economic development. That's not technically cost allocation, but it's important as part of the solution, because cost allocation conversations have been a certain particular set of questions and a certain particular set of stakeholders, right, coming up with this calculation. And the reality is, like, with the change that we are seeing in electricity, in the stakeholder space, in the public participation space, we have to have more answers for more people, right? And that narrowly defined issue of cost allocation isn't necessarily going to answer all of the questions that people have or challenges that they have with transmission that's coming their way. And so I think it's important to broaden that conversation sometimes, and not to undercut the necessity of the difficulties of cost allocation, but that these community benefits agreements and these economic development dollars are ways that those two efforts should be working together to identify solutions that can work for everyone equitably.
And that's a great synergy sort of between the panelists. Appreciate you raising that, Liza. So with that, open up for questions to the audience.
To steal it away from you earlier, Stacey.
Yeah, thanks. Stuart Nackmius from Con Edison Transmission. So really interesting and I think indisputable, the economic and reliability and resiliency benefits of additional transmission. Cost allocation, very important, because states ultimately have to agree with the cost allocation because they hold the permitting card, right? So that's important. But when I look at all the information, and the one piece that I don't see is the impact on generation mix and carbon in different regions. And when I think about the Northeast in particular, New England, New York, New Jersey, not all of PJM, but New Jersey, very aggressive clean energy goals, spending a lot of money on offshore wind and bringing that onto shore. And I think part of the story is to convince them or have data that shows the impact on the carbon fuel mix for their region. Because if they see the additional transmission as bringing in more dirtier source power than what they're paying for, they're not going to want to pay, and they're not going to want to site that transmission. So how do we address that issue, and is anybody looking at the regional fuel mix that results from the increased transmission?
So one piece of research I know on this is from Jesse Jenkins at the Net Zero Lab at Princeton in one of the states you mentioned. So he's an academic that's a leading thinker on decarbonization and how the grid mix is evolving. He was very instrumental in advising the Democratic Party in crafting the Inflation Reduction Act. He came out with a piece of research around the end of the last Congress where he analyzed what the difference would be in grid mix and ultimately in emissions between a scenario where we expand the grid at a kind of 1% rate versus a 2% rate on an annual basis, and found that what is at stake there is the difference between achieving 100% of the expected emissions reductions of the Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA and receiving 20% of the emissions benefits. So that is a staggering difference. Now, I can't speak to the methodology of his research, and the devil is obviously going to be in the details and where you build the lines. But at a very high level, there are benefits that accrue to the carbon mix and to being able to decarbonize more quickly by building out transmission. And that should be our prior, right? None of us should be surprised by this finding, because when you have variable resources, when you have weather with a length scale that's smaller than the country, being able to move power around is advantageous.
Nationally, you're talking about, not regionally or locally. And I think the challenge is locally, because locally it may not be better. And that's where I think we need more data.
Right. I would just say, as a federal policymaker, who nevertheless represents a state, we should keep our eye on the national picture, right? Emissions, the atmosphere is well mixed. If we all only look at the emissions over our own state.
I agree with you, but don't customers
Right.
are paying for all the offshore wind generation that they have to now send that to other states. They're not going to want to do that.
So
Yeah,
you're
fair
getting into the exact issue we've experienced within the SPP region too. So I'll give you another, this is a regional data point for you, right? So our peak load is 53-ish gigawatts. And our current generation capacity nameplate's a little over 100 gigawatts. Our interconnection queue currently sits at about 120 gigawatts of additional generation, almost exclusively wind and solar with some batteries, right? So the question being asked within the SPP region is, where's all this generation going and who's going to pay to get it there? Because it's not going to sink within the SPP region, right? So it's the same issue you're dealing with there, which is why I think this question of interregional transfer capability really comes into play.
I saw Devin's hand over here first.
Devin McMacken with ITC. First, I just want to thank all the panelists for your thought leadership on a really important issue. And I can say at WIRES, I mean, we've had interregional transmission planning panels going back years and years. And I think what's always been missing from those discussions is, what is the planning driver? Because you can have the best planning process in the world, but if you don't know what you're planning for, it's hard to have real results. So I think that's potentially where the minimum transfer capability concept is elegant, because it establishes sort of a simple planning driver that everybody can understand. And I think it's also relatively easy to see how it fits into kind of some of the existing joint planning processes that we have right now and that we all participate in. So that being said, I mean, you've talked about the challenge of cost allocation, and we all know that is definitely going to be where objections come from. So I guess for you, Daniel, specific to your bill, could you talk a little more about how it treats the cost allocation issue? And then also, as we hear those objections come up, for those of us who are interested in this concept, how can we better respond to those sorts of concerns?
Yeah, thank you, Devin, and really appreciate your company's leadership on this issue over the years. You obviously, as transmission-only utility, have a very unique perspective to bring to the table on all of this. The Big Wires Act on cost allocation. So recall that the kind of mechanism at the heart of the bill is this 2-year period of simultaneous bilateral negotiations between the regions, with FERC acting as a backstop on that. Part of what the regions are assigned to come up with during that 2-year period is that plan that specifies who's going to build the line, who's going to pay for it, what the timeline is going to be. That who's going to pay for it is the instrumental phrase here. So that will essentially act as a forcing mechanism for not only planning, which is what minimum transfer also is, but as a forcing mechanism for cost allocation. So, we're not going in and meddling in the commission's existing cost allocation principles and saying you should do this instead of the stuff you've historically been approving cost allocation for. So it will kind of be along the lines of what the Commission's historic cost and existing cost allocation principles are. And our thesis, going back to these numbers and the reliability benefits and what we've seen in Uri and Elliott and all these benefits that people widely agree on and that would naturally be accounted for in the Commission's existing principles, is that should be adequate to at least get us to a minimum amount and start capitalizing on these benefits that we know are in store for our nation if we're able to do this.
Thank you, Drew. Nick Kelley, Gibson Dunn, thank you so much for being here, each of you. So my question about sort of your proposed legislation is that if there's to be a minimum transfer capability that is a must-build requirement across the United States, that sort of standard sort of resonates with me as a reliability standard, that you must transform your system to meet these requirements for the betterment of the system and for what is expected of electric utilities across the board. Now, a lot of the reliability requirements for the transmission owners in each region have been set through Order 1000. Do you expect through this legislation that those requirements will kind of create a new flavor of a project, or will this fit neatly within some of the reliability planning standards that are in existence today?
I'll be honest, I don't have sophisticated opinions on the answer to that question, but I'd love to sit down with you and anyone else interested and think that through. What I will say at a high level is that the bill takes the approach of marrying in reliability, resiliency on the one hand to affordability on the other. So one approach we strongly considered at the outset of the bill was to do this under Section 215 of the Federal Power Act, to strike the savings clause there that says FERC shall not, mandate the building of new transmission, and do this purely through the NERC side. Another approach we considered was to do this through Sections 205 and 206 and direct a FERC rulemaking, purely from the perspective of just and reasonable rates. But as I was saying earlier when I was speaking, after the slides, that the separation between these benefit metrics is really, more artificial than actual. We should absolutely be thinking in terms of reliability, and we should absolutely be thinking in terms of affordability and cost. And the bill specifically sets out a new section of the Federal Power Act that has its directive to kind of optimize on both of those and on resiliency simultaneously. And so the vision for the bill is to kind of, take into account, if we're going to be building hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars of massive infrastructure projects, it would behoove us to consider both the ability, of course, to keep the lights on, but also to lower rates for Americans.
Well, in the spirit of P.T. Barnum, Wires always likes to leave them wanting more, and I think that's where we're going to be at with this panel, because we could go on for quite a while on this topic, and I realized that when we set it up, but it's just so timely and so critical to the discussion on transmission. I thought it was really helpful for us to have this. So everybody, please join me in thanking our moderator and panel. And that wraps up our second and last panel. And Stacey, I'll turn it over to you in case you have any closing comments or remarks before we wrap it up. And I'll just add that after the conclusion, we do have lunch available for folks. It's over in the room where we had the breakfast this morning and dinner last evening. So everyone's welcome to go over there and get a bite to eat. But before we do that, Stacey, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Oh, I just want to say thank you to everyone. I think this has been a really educational and thoughtful day, so we appreciate your level of engagement, and I think we had a great discussion. So thank you all.
All right, thanks everybody.